Hey, Mama Bears. Are you pregnant and wondering if an epidural is right for you? Maybe you're afraid of having a needle in your back, but you're also afraid of the pain of labor and you're not really sure what to do. Maybe you've heard all of the opinions ranging from, of course, you'll want an epidural. Get an epidural. You'll be begging for it. All the way to, why would you ever consider an epidural? I'm Jamie Zaki, and I'm a nurse, doula, and lactation consultant, and I am here to answer all of your birth, pregnancy, and breastfeeding related questions. Today, we're going to chat about epidurals. Some women love them, some women hate them, so what gives? Let's take a few minutes to learn about the pros and the cons of epidurals, and then I'll share my own birth experience with and without an epidural. Real quick, before we dive too deep, I would like to ask you if you can take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. That way you can get updates with new videos each week with tips on birth, pregnancy, and breastfeeding. If you have any questions that you want me to explore, go ahead and drop them in the comments so that I can get your questions answered. So if we're going to use the brain model, we're going to do benefits, risks, alternatives, intuition, now and never. Then first we're going to explore the benefits of epidurals. So what are the benefits of getting an epidural? Benefits of getting an epidural are pain relief. The number one reason why anyone wants an epidural is to experience a reduction in the perception of pain during labor. The intention with getting an epidural is to essentially numb the body from the waist down so that you don't have to feel labor or feel birth. Another reason women often need pharmaceutical pain relief is because they are so exhausted and have been in labor for so long, often without food or nutrition, and they can't keep their energy up. So they need to rest. But the ongoing anticipation of discomfort is causing them to tense up between contractions. This makes you even more tired. This becomes cyclical and creates more tension, which creates more exhaustion, and so on. And this increases your cortisol levels, which are stress hormones, and actually inhibits labor. So before you know it, mom is working 10 times harder than she should be and making little progress. If this is causing a mom to not progress in labor, sometimes getting an epidural can give her a chance to rest and regain some energy, and then she can focus on pushing her baby out. Another reason that some people consider an epidural is that if they were to have an emergency cesarean, then they can ensure that they will be awake because they have an epidural already in place versus requiring general anesthesia. Sometimes I believe this is a perfectly legitimate conversation to have. I hesitate to cite it as a benefit because in most situations, there is enough time to place an epidural for what's called an emergency C-section, which typically is urgent and happens during labor, but is not necessarily emergent. It's not considered likely to experience a true emergency C-section that would require delivery so quick that there would be no time to place an epidural, but that does happen. So this is where weighing pros and cons and benefits and risks come into play. And this is when we have conversations about acceptance in birth and realizing that we can't prevent everything. My personal opinion on this is that I would never suggest getting an epidural for this reason alone, as I believe it would actually increase other risks that I choose to avoid. And if I was to have an emergency that required an immediate delivery and therefore general anesthesia, I personally would feel that I would just have to accept that I did what I felt was best for my body and my baby, and God or life had other plans. Next, we are talking about the risks of getting an epidural. So, some of the risks of getting an epidural is that there can be side effects. There can be long-term and short-term side effects associated with epidurals. For some people, they can cause long-term headaches. You've heard of spinal headaches or epidural headaches. For some people, they can cause fever during labor or low blood pressure, both of which could result in the need for an emergency cesarean delivery. Additionally, the medication mixed into epidurals can have a variety of other side effects that could negatively impact mom or baby. You could feel drowsy. You could have an allergic reaction. That's true with any medication. There could be a litany of other side effects that come with these medications. Epidurals don't always work. Some women will experience the paralyzing effect of an epidural without the pain relieving effect of an epidural. This can be extremely frustrating because it's hard to utilize alternative coping mechanisms when you are immobile. But feeling intense discomfort can be challenging. Um, Another risk of the epidural is that it's too intense so that you don't feel anything. And for some people, that might be okay. But the problem becomes that when it's time for pushing, you can't feel what your body is signaling. If you can't feel when a contraction is coming, you're going to be told when to push, how long to push for. And this could result in you pushing extra hard and not feeling it, which could result in hemorrhoids and an increased risk of perineal tears, exhaustion, and a longer pushing phase. This is why I recommend waiting for your body to push for itself, but that's a different conversation for a different day. Likewise, the inability to move around can make it difficult to work with your body in labor. While there are plenty of position changes to help facilitate labor, even if you're stuck in bed with an epidural, your mobility is limited, and research shows that being active during labor can shorten your labor and help your baby descend more effectively. Some women may have health conditions like low platelet counts, where epidurals are contraindicated and considered too risky to even be an option. So, then we need to consider alternatives to getting an epidural. A lot of times people think it's either epidural or intense pain, and that's not necessarily true. There are alternatives. So, as far as pharmaceuticals go, an alternative medication to an epidural would be IV pain medication. Typically, this would be morphine given intravenously. As with any medication, the benefits and risks of this medication will need to be explored and discussed with your team. This may not always be an option depending on how advanced your labor is. If there's reason to believe that your baby will be born very soon, providers typically would not consider morphine as an option because it can result in a sleepy baby. We can talk about IV pain relief in another video if you guys would like. Another option is sterile water injections, where two injections of sterile water are placed subdermally in the sacral area. That means they're placed just under the skin, kind of where your tailbone is on either side. Um, and similar to this would be using a TENS unit. Other things like massage, breathing techniques, aromatherapy, having hydrotherapy, which could be a warm shower or a bath. Hydrotherapy allows your muscles to relax between contractions a little easier, and this can mean that your contractions are perceived with less intensity. Hydrotherapy is often called the midwife's epidural. Counterpressure, breathing techniques, acupressure, position changes are all forms of non pharmaceutical comfort measures that can be used to cope with labor contractions. So, if we've explored alternatives, next we have to talk about intuition when getting an epidural. Deciding if you want an epidural will depend a lot on your philosophy of birth, your overall experience, your support, and your intuition. I said I'd share a little about my personal experience with epidurals, so I'm going to do that now. With my second born, my first VBAC, I labored for over 30 hours with an epidural, but due to exhaustion and stalled labor, my intuition told me I needed to go ahead and get an epidural so I could rest. In hindsight, as disappointed as I was to get an epidural against my plan, it was absolutely the right decision. After just a half hour of rest, I went into transition and began to labor down. With my next birth, I had an unmedicated VBAC. I did not have an epidural as I was giving birth at home, and that was absolutely the right decision for that labor. I was more emotionally relaxed, I had nutrition during labor, and I was better able to focus on birth and cope more effectively without an epidural. So, now and never is the next thing that we talk about. Sometimes when you're in transition, even if you're dead set against an epidural, you might want to get one. When I'm supporting a mom before labor, I tell her to come up with a safe word to relay how serious she is about getting an epidural. When I'm working with a mom in labor who I know was very adamant about no epidural, when she first says she wants it, I'll ask if she needs it right now or if she can get through 3 more contractions or through another hour. If she says that she can get through 3 more contractions, we focus on that. And then I mention trying a different comfort measure. On the other hand, if she insists that she needs it now, we will alert the medical team and find new coping mechanisms while we wait. Sometimes just the thought that relief is coming is enough for a mom to relax. And sometimes this will even allow her to progress so quickly, she might end up having the baby before the epidural arrives. So, a common question: is it ever too early or too late for an epidural? Some will say no, some will say yes. Here's my opinion: getting an epidural before active labor is way too early. And while getting an epidural during transition is not technically too late, medically speaking, and is very attractive, it doesn't logically make much sense to me. Getting an epidural requires you to sit very still. And depending on how long it takes to take effect, you could have to lie flat and still for a very long time, or what feels like a long time. If you're in transition or about to start pushing, this would be extremely difficult and maybe even impossible, and likely more painful than what you were already experiencing. Of course, the decision is always yours to make, but this is something to consider ahead of time before you're in that fragile emotional state where logic kind of goes out the window. And that's why it's important to discuss these things with your medical team and your support team ahead of time, so that we can just kind of remind you of, hey, this is where you're at. Remember, we talked about expecting this. Are you sure that's what you want to do? So, I told you guys that I would share my own epidural experience with you, and I already touched on that a little bit. So, I want to kind of elaborate on my experience with epidurals. I mentioned before that during my first feedback, due to exhaustion, getting an epidural was absolutely the right decision for me. And I do want to say that it wasn't necessarily easier. It was just different having an epidural versus not having an epidural. Um, when I got the epidural, it took a while for it to take, thanks to being a redhead. They kept having to give me more medication and see if it was taking, and I had to lay flat that entire time, which was very excruciating. Eventually, I had enough medication that it took the edge off, and I was okay with that. They wanted to give me more because they thought I should have been more numb, but I was in a spot where I was comfortable. I was able to feel things, but still relax, and I felt like that was the perfect sweet spot. Um, that said, pushing was much harder with an epidural than without. And I think a lot of us find a lot of fear around the pushing stage, and that's why we get the epidural, because we think it's going to be really hard and painful to push a baby out. Um, I couldn't really feel the buildup of the contraction to know when to push. So I would feel the peak of the contraction. And so I would start pushing then, but then it was kind of late. I wasn't working with my body. So I pushed for a really long time and I worked really hard and I was getting exhausted. And I was also very frustrated because my body very desperately wanted to be in an upright position and I couldn't get into that position. I very desperately wanted to be in a standing squat and I couldn't do it because I was very numb. So that was very challenging. I did end up tearing, and I think that might be part of the reason why. I'll never know for sure. But another thing that surprised me, and there's no evidence on this, this is just my experience, and a few friends of mine who have also had birth with and without an epidural have similar experiences. I actually felt what we call the ring of fire. I actually felt the ring of fire more with my epidural than I did without. And I don't have any science to back that up, but I personally think that it might be like a perception thing, or maybe it had to do with the position that I was in pushing. I don't really know. But that was something, looking back after having an unmedicated birth, that I was really shocked by, because a lot of times that's one of the biggest fears we have, is feeling that ring of fire. And I felt it more intensely with the epidural. And I thought I was crazy, but I have many friends who have experienced the same thing. So if you also have experienced the ring of fire more intensely with an epidural birth than without an epidural, I would love if you shared that in the comments because I'm very curious to see if other people are experiencing that also. Looking back, I would not have done either birth any differently. Um, my first vaginal birth after cesarean was amazing, and it wasn't exactly what I envisioned, but having an epidural was the right decision. And I've said that a couple times. But um, I, for my home birth, I firmly believe that had I been in the hospital, I would have ended up with an epidural. I had a very weird contraction pattern, and typically in the hospital, if you have the pattern that I had, they would give you Pitocin. That would make your contractions a little more regular and stronger or more effective, is the belief and the purpose there. Um, I believe that they would have talked me into Pitocin because of my weird contraction pattern. And I believe that I would have ended up getting an epidural because Pitocin contractions can be very intense. Um, and I fear that that actually would have made it harder to birth my 10-pound baby. Um, So I had to change positions a lot during pushing with her. I didn't have an epidural, so I went from hands and knees to the tub to standing to squatting and then this kind of stand squat thing, which is the position she was born in. I believe that all of those position changes were needed to help her do that final rotation before descending. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had an epidural. It would have been much harder to know what my body needed and to respond to that. So I actually think I might have ended up in an emergency delivery um, if I had an epidural with her birth. But again, that just goes to show how every birth and every baby is different and how your birth setting and your birth mindset can play such a big role in how your birth comes out. Of course, there's always going to be crazy things out of our control that happen, but not always. So the decisions that you make can very directly impact your birth outcome in that way. So I'm going to stop rambling now. I think if you found this video helpful, I would love it if you give me a thumbs up, subscribe so that next week you can go ahead and get a video on my different labor positions. That's going to be a good one. I'm excited. And if you have any questions you'd like me to answer, go ahead and ask them in the comments. Go ahead in the description below and find the link for my Facebook page also because I want you guys to pop over there. I do weekly Q&As. Follow me on social media. I'm excited to interact with you guys and answer your questions. I love to share information with you guys, but I want to hear what your questions are and start answering your questions. Bye.